I believed it was the right thing to support Ukraine no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wrong. I was dead wrong.
Well,
And
millions of Canadians also felt like that.
hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Radical Center. We're going to be diving into a busy week in Canadian politics. I think that
Mm-hmm.
it is fair to say. We're going to be talking about Canadian employment numbers. We're going to talk about Prime Minister Mark Carney's military raise. So we'll get into that as we
I'll do
speak.
that. I'll do that for you.
Okay, you'll do that for me. Amazing, amazing. We're also going to talk about the U.S.-Russia peace talks in
Right.
Alaska. It's the meeting is happening as we speak. So if anything changes in the middle of our recording, we'll be reacting to it live. We look domestically. We've got a by-election for Pierre Poilievre next week. We'll break down. I mean, there's a poll that says he's going to win by 83%. Don't think that's necessarily a big deal. But we will talk about new polling for the country that shows anything from a massive liberal majority to the status quo. We'll talk about Jenni Byrne and her first interview. And then finally, we'll also be talking about the current media landscape and how a new generation of news consumers are getting their information from places like TikTok and
Mm-hmm.
uh, podcasts like this. And once again, joining me to discuss all this is Ian. Ian, how are you?
I'm pretty good. And you're right. Been a very busy week in politics.
Even though they're all at the cottage, somehow there's still news to be made, right? So, Ian, let's start with that jobs report. What was your immediate reaction when you heard about those job numbers?
Well, it's the fourth month in a row that we've had a decline in the jobs numbers. This month was a very large decline. It was over 40,000, and it matches the biggest decline since COVID, which is really amazing because the economy. Mr. Carney is supposed to be Mr. Economy, and it's not working. The Royal Bank has issued a report giving us reasons why it's not working. The number one reason they give is not tariffs, it's interest rates being held up by the Bank of Canada. And it says that is depressing investment by Canadian firms. And it makes sense. I talked to a real estate developer. They're not building anything. I don't know if you're aware of this, but developers are not building anything in the GTA. And one guy told me that he's with bank rates to them, their usual bank rates are about 7%. They're having to pay 10 to 12% to the bank just to break ground. He says they can't make money at that. So they're uh, they're they're keeping the land, waiting for rates to drop before they build anything. And that relates to the politics of housing. Because if the
Right.
developers can't build it and government can't, they government is going to pay a slightly lower rate to borrow money to build housing, but not a lot,
Right.
smaller.
And you're right. You're right about the construction industry because that's exactly where I work. I work in high rise,
Okay.
and it is a really, I'm a 309A certified Red Seal electrician,
Right.
which many people who know me know that about me. It's a tough time right now, and you're seeing it in the construction industry, you're seeing it in the
Mhm.
tech industry, and many other industries. There is, people are going to blame the tariffs, people, but it's just investment is fleeing this country because they're looking at Canada as a very bad place to do business. And
Well,
you
that's
can
another thing I wanted to get into is I checked the Stats Canada report just today, and the first line in the Stats Canada report about capital outflows, and I'll read it directly. Canada's reputation as a safe haven is starting to crack. Now that's an amazing thing to be
Mhm.
reading on a government website, because sometimes you get analysts saying that, and you wonder what their bias is. In the last 4 months, 84 billion dollars has left the country. 84 billion. That is consumers who have sold off their Canadian stocks and they're buying US stocks. Quite interesting. So they're far more
Right.
bullish on the US economy than they are on the Canadian. And again, I look at Carney's reputation, and it's 4 months that he's been in power. So it gives me personally a lot of concern
Right.
because he was supposed to be Mr. Magic that was going to turn things around. And I've done my usual test to see whether we're going into a recession, which is I drive down the Danforth and Queen Street West, and I look for stores that are closing. Well, it's happening again.
Right.
And this happened before the last recession. And I can tell you from my time in government, the last people to tell you there's a recession are the government. You see it on the street long before they'll admit it. So we're
Yeah.
heading
Well,
into a recession.
Ron Butler was forecasting this way back in, last year, and he said that mortgage delinquencies and defaults are going up. Their
Yeah,
business is booming. That's bad. And like again, you can bitch and complain about the tariffs all you want, but the fact of the matter is that the United States is focused on drawing companies through tax incentives,
right.
regulation reduction, and yes,
And
tariff
we're
pressures.
not. We may
And
we
we're
may have
not.
promises of that, but until we have a budget, which is keeps getting put off until the fall, and we're now hearing out of Ottawa that it could be November before we have a budget. But whenever it comes out, it's going to show an additional $40 billion that the Carney government has spent by orders in council while Parliament is not sitting. Put that on top of the $50 billion deficit that Her Majesty left when she stopped being a finance minister for baby Trudeau. And we're looking at close to $100 billion in deficits in 1 year. Well, we have to borrow that money offshore because we can't raise that money internally. And the US rates are now at 7%. If we have to borrow it from New York, we're government is going to be paying 7%, maybe a little less, maybe 5, but for a long time.
Right, right. And look, to be fair, I'm glad you brought up Justin Trudeau because a lot of this was under the former Prime Minister
Right,
Justin Trudeau, and
right.
I think that the jury is still out on whether Mark Carney can actually manage an economic crisis like this because it's one thing being the governor of a bank, but it's different when you're in the driver's seat, right? He
Yes.
he he has set expectations high on a number of files, and including many of the things that we've discussed on the show, like tariffs,
Yeah,
military spending, and the rest of it. But I,
yeah.
I think that he's we'll talk about the polling, but I think he's got a short runway to deliver results for for the country. So I
Politically
think it
too, because not just for the country and the economy, but politically, his runway is getting shorter. And I think I
right,
talked about it last
right.
time that his honeymoon might last 18 months. If this keeps up, his honeymoon might be over in a year.
Right. So we're gonna get to the polling a little bit later in the show, but right now I want to get your reaction. Mark Carney just announced, well, not just announced, but last week he announced pay raises for members of the Canadian Armed Forces.
Long
In my
overdue.
right, it's the first major move in years aimed at addressing retention and recruitment challenges. So Ian, let's watch the Prime Minister, and then I'll get your
Okay.
reaction on the other side.
Would raise the pay of all members of the Canadian Armed Forces. And today, with Minister McGuinty and with Deputy Millett, I'm proud to fulfill that commitment
Yeah.
by announcing that all members of the Canadian Armed Forces will receive a pay raise. Specifically, there will be an 8% raise for colonels and above, a 13% raise for lieutenant colonels and below, and a 20% raise starting pay for privates in the regular force. These increases will be retroactive to April 1st of this year. There'll be increased.
Okay, so he goes on to talk about a lot more than just salary increases, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars really in investment in the Canadian military. So what's your reaction to that, Ian?
Well, it's long overdue. And I was watching another podcast earlier today where Tony Clement, who was a former cabinet minister for the Tories, was giving Carney credits on this one. And I agree that Tony did say, well, it's long overdue. But he said, thank goodness it's finally happened. The Canadian Armed Forces have been having a hard time keeping people and attracting people because the pay is so low. So this is a good first step. The only thing I did not like in the announcement was the very last part of the announcement was $4.5 billion for Ukraine. And that ties into what we're going to talk about, Trump meeting with Putin later. But $4.5 billion and only $2.6 billion over the next 5 years for the salary increases. I don't think we should be sending any more money to Ukraine. And Vice President Vance announced earlier this week when he was in Europe that the U.S. Money spigots are going to be turned off, and he wants Europe to pick up any more costs of money going to Ukraine. Why is Canada? We don't have $4.5 billion to throw around.
I think we're gonna go a little bit deeper into that because
Yes.
I could certainly agree with you on that. When it comes to the military pay raises and what he's announcing for our military, I have struggled with this, and I'm not going to get political on this one. That's my instinct, but I'm just glad to see the Prime Minister giving, what, as Tony Clement said, a long overdue raise to the men and women who serve our country.
Yeah.
And I have family members, distant relatives who served in World War I. I have current living relatives who served in Bosnia and another preparing to join the military. And so this issue is definitely personal, but it is a reality that both liberal and conservative governments have a history of underfunding our armed forces.
I'll say.
Shortchanging, underfunding. So there's plenty of blame to go around. I think what matters now is that they're finally getting this. And again, these are the expectations that Mark Carney set. And I hope that he's able to reform the armed forces because it's needed. So you mentioned Ukraine. We're gonna if you have anything else to add on the military pay raises, or can we move on to Ukraine?
Just one thing that I'm just looking at how the money's going to be spent. $1 billion to defend the Arctic, long overdue. So if you look at how the money is being allocated, $4.5 billion to Ukraine, $2 billion to NATO, which is overdue, and $1 billion for Canadian Arctic, plus the salary increases, of course. All good programs.
Okay, so let's pivot. We're gonna go to Ukraine. This is the biggest news in the world of the week. I don't know if there's anything else going on that is this important. But as we speak, U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin are meeting at an American military base in Alaska to discuss the war in Ukraine, is how I'll put it.
It's a discussion. I believe that too. I don't think we're going to see much come out of it.
All right, so speaking of that, the White House says that Trump, well, it's changed a little bit, but Trump's aim is to listen. But he did warn of severe consequences if Russia rejects a ceasefire. This could be a diplomatic dead end, or it could be, a breakthrough. There's a lot to say from my perspective, but there is, before I toss it to you, Ian, I'm just going to take like 1 or 2 minutes to preface this conversation from my perspective. And last week I talked about a mea culpa on COVID, and this week I'm talking about a mea culpa on Ukraine. Because when the war began, you can still go onto my social media and you can find me in Pearson Airport and in a Ukrainian bank wearing a Ukrainian hat. And back then, I believed it was the right thing to support Ukraine no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wrong. I was dead wrong.
Well, millions of Canadians also felt like that.
And I thank you for that. But look, I pushed to keep the war going at all costs, ignoring my own principles. And those videos are still up, not because I'm prideful of them, but it's a reminder of how wrong I was. And the war has gone on for far too long. From the start, countries like Canada didn't try and end it. We're
Right.
still writing checks. I mean, I think we ran out of weapons to ship. And all throughout this, we've been telling ourselves that we're helping. But I think the most fucking outrageous part of this conversation is the same Canadian media and politicians that begged for peace since the beginning are now falling over themselves to predetermine this meeting as a failure. So, look, I liked the slogan that Pierre had, which was Canada first. And in the Ukraine and Russia situation, we need to ask ourselves what's best for Canada, not Ukraine, not Russia, not Europe, not the United States. So, with that, Ian, I'll just toss it over to you. What is Canada's role in all of this?
Well, first of all, Canada has a large contingent of ex-Ukrainians going back many, many years, especially in Western Canada. And the ones that I've talked to here in Toronto want to stop the killing. They don't want it to continue. And, a ceasefire is a first step in that. What Carney has done a complete 180 on Canada's position. We've always been the peacemaker. We've always come in when there are world disputes around the world with peacekeeping forces, negotiating behind the scenes, that sort of thing. Our prime ministers have been asked by U.S. presidents many times to do that. And what Carney has done is he has sided with the European Union, who are war hawks on this. He attended a meeting this week with all the presidents and prime ministers of Europe, and their statement came out, and I'll just read part of it, that the military and economic pressure must be maintained on Russia. Well, that's not going for peace. And I don't know any Canadian that agrees with Mr. Carney turning us into people who support more war instead of peace. Now, it hasn't got a lot of publicity, but it's a very important step that he's taken.
And that's what I talk about when I talk about the Canadian media. Like, there are respected journalists that I used to consider people who, when you needed a no bullshit answer and you needed just the facts, that you could go to them. And now, like I said, they're all falling over themselves because Orange Man bad. It makes no fucking sense. Everything that they've said, and this is the weird, twisted logic. At the same time, they say, well, Russia's economy is going down the tubes and Russia is losing the war. That's why we still need to send money to Ukraine. But if Ukraine is winning the war, then why do we need to keep shoveling out the over $20 billion? It makes no sense, right? And I don't want to be this guy who gets on here and yells angry into the microphone like like an idiot. But like there's a point where we have to say enough is enough. And if the United States is able to stop the killing, as the president says,
right,
I'm all for that, because $4 billion should be put back into the pockets of Canadians right now who
need it. Yeah.
And, Vladimir Zelensky, he's not a war hero. He's an actor who's clinging on to power because he knows that when the election is held in Ukraine, he'll no longer be in power, right? There's lots of problems on the Russian side too.
Right.
But my point is we have to stop this fake fucking moral outrage because Orange Man bad or Putin bad or Ukraine good, and we need to start focusing on our own fucking country. If Mark Carney stood up and he said that, I'd be a lot happier. Ian, go ahead.
Okay. Well, there are several analysts in the United States, ex-military, who are saying publicly that uh, that Russia has won this war. One of them is Lieutenant General, I'm getting his name right, Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who was a former defense advisor to Trump in term number one. He's gone public saying this war is over and there needs to be an exit strategy. And he complains that we didn't have an exit strategy in Vietnam. We didn't have one uh, in Afghanistan. And those just dragged on and cost a lot of money. He's saying we have to end it. And ironically, that's what got Trump elected. He said that over and over again. I remember one time he said he's going to end the war in a week. And that's not possible because, the logistics, etc. So now we're 6-7 months into it, and he hasn't made much progress. And I think he wants to. I think he wants to, and especially when you look at the U.S. economy, $36 billion in unfunded liabilities, basically, and they're going to have to borrow more money somewhere to send any more to Ukraine, which is why I think Vance said we're cutting off the pipeline this week.
Right. And Trump has been relatively measured on both sides. He swatted down Zelensky before. He's been really tough on Zelensky. He's gone out public and he said, to Putin that he's really upset because he would be in a meeting and they're talking about peace. And then the next day they're bombing a hospital or something. So look,
you're right. He has been tough on both of them. It's
right.
not
and
as
Obama didn't want to send Ukraine weapons. Trump did. So again, it's could go on and on and on about this. But
he has a mixed cabinet. Let's look at that. And some of them are war hawks. And so, if you're the president or prime minister and you want to have cohesion coming out of the cabinet room, you give some here, you give some. So Kennedy is doing a lot on health. And, so the other guy gets up and says, we need to send more money to Ukraine. And, he's the chairman of the meeting. So he says, okay, a little bit here and a little bit there. But do believe that he's serious about wanting to end the war.
Right. And he's it's the apple of his eye, right? It's been one of the major top foreign policy accomplishments that he's been wanting to do. It's something that he hasn't been able to accomplish this far. But look, I think at some point the United States is just going to say, you know what? We can't make peace here. If you guys want to kill each other, go for it.
He'll just walk away, maybe.
Right. And we had mentioned when we were talking on the phone earlier this week, I had brought up the situation, which a lot of Canadians, I don't know how they felt. I think the Canadian media, as they do with Donald Trump, they look at it sideways. But anyways, the Oval Office outburst, Zelensky almost had a mineral deal and he threw a temper tantrum, or he stood up, however you want to, characterize it. He got out, he walked up, he flew over to Europe to beg them for more money. And then after he left, Keir Starmer, one of our biggest allies, he said, look, if the United States is not involved in peace talks or even funding the war, then it's over. We can't do it without them.
Yeah.
So I think that just about wraps that up. I'm keeping an eye on it. They're still in the meeting. If anything happens, then I'll let you know and we'll cut right in. But let's move on. So in the past week, we have a new wave of polls that have been released. It presents a wide range of outcomes for the next federal election, everything from a massive liberal majority to a political landscape that looks much of what it does right now. So let's take a look at these numbers. If you look at Nanos, they have the Liberals at 224 seats. Liaison has 200 seats for the Liberals. Abacus is on the more status quo. They have the Liberals at 143 seats. And then you also have
168.
And then Leger, I think, was yesterday, Liberals 206 seats. So that's that. These polls are modeled by somebody who I really like. I just give him a shout out. Can't pronounce his Twitter account, but I can pronounce his handle, which is @RealAlbanianPat from polywave.com. He does it by himself. He's self-funded. And I just really like his projections because there's no opinion. He's just straight down the middle. He's sort of like Real Clear Politics from the United States. So, Ian, what are your initial thoughts on
Well,
these polls?
both in politics and then as a consultant for many years, I've hired almost all the polling firms in Canada, and I can tell you that almost all of them are biased either left or right. Um, in the Liberal Party, our polling was Marzolini was our pollster for all the time I was there, and we always did well. And they find ways in their presentations to show you the upside, right? That's their job. I found that Angus Reid back in the day was probably the most accurate pollster. Today, Angus has retired, and even his firm doesn't seem to be as good as it used to be. And I know from looking at the polling and doing, analyzing it, analyzing the engine of polling, I can see how even the way you place the questions and the various other tactics, you can skew the polls. So, and the other thing I learned about polling is they're a snapshot in time, and to get a trend line, you have to wait and see polls for 3 or 4 months. So, is there a trend here? Well, one trend is that it's status quo. Another trend is the Liberals are doing really well. And I can tell you, if the Liberals' internal polling is showing that they're doing as well as these snapshots in time, they're going to call an election, maybe before the budget, because the budget's going to be bad news. I don't think it's sustainable. From what we talked about earlier, about how clearly we're heading into a recession and there's capital outflows, this is not the time for an incumbent party to take a chance on calling an election. So I want to wait and see the next 2 or 3 or 4 months of polls to see if we actually have a trend.
Yeah,
Now,
I agree with you.
a couple of
Go
things
ahead.
I just want to point out is that all of these polls, the block is up. They're up a little bit. They're either at 6 or 7%, and at 6 or 7, 2 elections ago, that gave them a lot more seats than they have today. 10 more, for example, which would have made the difference for Carney in his minority. It might even have changed the who won on election night. So if there's a softening of the Liberal vote in Quebec, that's a problem for the Liberals. The polling elsewhere seemed to be pretty stable in the Abacus report, and the differences were marginal in the usual Liberal spots: Ontario, Atlantic Canada, and the Tory vote was holding in the West. So, do you take a chance on this poll? No, you don't. You wait and see.
If the
And one more
if
thing. The reason I think that the Liberal vote is softening up in Quebec is Quebec is the one place in Canada that is most vulnerable to U.S. action. All of New England and New York State buy most of their electricity from Quebec. It's a huge inflow of cash for the province of Quebec. Ontario has a little bit of impact on the auto, but the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement is covering about 90% of the tariff problem for auto industry in Ontario. So if Trump gets mad at Canada again and goes after those two Quebec markets, the other one is aluminum, then Quebec will switch on a dime.
well, no wonder the Quebec has relinquished the title of separatists because they have a
Yes,
lot
they have.
right now.
Yeah.
Confederation has a benefit to them. Look, I'm not going to go too deep into it. I agree with you. If this is a trend, if this is real, if I'm Mark Carney, same thing I said to Doug Ford in November, don't
Yep.
walk,
Run.
run to the governor general and call an election. You got the two-party, you got Pierre doesn't have a seat yet. You got the NDP without a leader. I mean, the bloc, it says they might lose 1 or 2 seats, whatever. Long story short, run, don't walk. There's a few reasons why, though, I think that the jury is still out on these numbers. First, the Conservative is coming off on a loss, and their voters may feel demoralized. Second, Pierre has been out of the political spotlight because, he's been trying to win his seat. Third, for someone like Doug Ford, who has federal ambitions, I think that a lot of this data is being used to build a narrative that the Conservative Party needs a new leader,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense. This is what they did to Biden last year when he was losing. They said, "Here, Mr. President, look at the numbers. You can't win."
And a lot of Tories that I've been talking to informally, I think it's time to look at Ford.
Right. And finally, if these are real, if these numbers are real, then um, just call an election, because he needs there is a compelling argument to be made that Mark Carney could lead the Liberals to a majority government if these things are real. Of course, we'll keep an eye.
If he were to call an election, I would say watch out for the Peterson trap, because Dave Peterson called his election with 96 seats out of 130, and the recession was coming, and they did not acknowledge it, but I saw it on the street, and people were talking about it informally, and Ray, who was a total unknown, used that in his entire election. He said, "I'm talking to people who are losing their jobs. I'm talking to people who can't afford things anymore." And
Right. And then again, I'm not saying that's what he should do. I'm saying that if
yeah,
I were him and I were to, I need to make
if you
the
believe the
argument
polls, yeah,
if you believe the polls, right? And I'm not saying I'm just saying that the jury is still out. Okay.
right.
We'll check back, we'll continue to follow this, and we'll have a close eye, and hopefully soon in a few months we'll have a clearer picture. But just real quick, Pierre Poilievre projected to win his riding with roughly 80% of the vote. Again, talking about polls, this is a by-election poll. By-election polls don't have a very good history. I guess
Right.
I would phrase it to you like this. If what's make or break for Pierre Poilievre? If he loses, say, less than 70%, is that still a win, or does that call his leadership into question?
Well, the by-election is not the key. In January, they're going to have a party convention where he faces a vote. So that if he only wins this by-election by 50 or 60%, which is in most elections, that's huge, right? It will affect his vote in January. And the anti-forces will start electing delegates, and he may be in trouble in January. And again, the January vote can't be 50% plus one, the way that Bonnie Crombie is pretending in Ontario with her vote in September. If she gets
Or
50, yeah,
well, Jason Kenney, didn't he get just over the threshold, but he
yeah,
still resigned?
Kenny, I've met him, and he's a very smart, he's a politician, good political instincts. He knew that he was in trouble when the vote was that low, and that he'd have to fight like hell to hold on his job, and he didn't want to do that.
Right. So we'll touch in. We'll see what the results are next week. But let's move on. This was an interesting one. Jenni Byrne, in her first interview since the Conservatives' election loss, she stated that while some mistakes were made, that it didn't ultimately change the outcome. She defends her campaign strategy, including the decision to focus on affordability. She's obviously not going to lead the Conservatives into the next campaign. So with that in mind, I know you got a lot of thoughts on this, because you were sending me a furious email this week about that. So Ian, tell the viewers what you sent to me this week and why you think it's a load of hogwash.
Well, and since I sent the flurry of emails, I've talked to some conservative friends of mine. The ones I talked to one who knows Jenni Byrne and kind of likes her, but agrees that she's tough and she's brittle and she turns a lot of people off in her party. And other people the conservatives I talked to, said that Jenni Byrne is like the Liberal Party's Gerald Butts. And I know that in the Liberal Party, half the party hated Butts by the end of Baby Trudeau's term. So they're both lightning rod figures. And not only that, look at her history. She was a campaign manager for Harper in the last election that he ran in 2015. And when they realized they were losing, in the last 2 weeks of the campaign, Jenni Byrne came up with this turn in your Muslim neighbors and a hotline to do that because she thought it would hold some seats. Well, it did the opposite. I have two friends who were running in the GTA for the Conservatives, and they both told me that they lost re-election in those last 2 weeks because of Jenni Byrne. And they're still angry at her today. So then she goes from there to her friend Pierre. And I say her friend because they used to date when she was at University of Ottawa, and she was working for the Reform Party. And then they lived together for a while. So Jenni had his ear.
They were more than friends in a former
They were
life.
more than friends. They were more than friends with benefits. And Jenni had his ear for a number of years, that is Pierre, and convinced him that he had to be a street fighter. And he became a street fighter. And when he was leader of the opposition, he did a very good job in that role. However, when you run for prime minister, you have to look prime ministerial. And in the campaign, he did not. They won the first campaign, which was against Baby Trudeau. They were going to win with majority, axe attacks, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Carney comes along with Mr. Butts, and they axe attacks. So the issue was gone, and they didn't change the strategy. And Jenni has confirmed with her interviews this week that she's quite happy that they didn't change the strategy. Well, she was wrong. When Canada faced an existential issue, Trump earlier on was talking about annexing Canada. Regardless of your political stripe, everybody was upset about that. And Ford had just won an election on that. So Carney's people, Butts, said, okay, it worked for Ford, we'll do it too. Meanwhile, Jenni says, oh no, that's their issue. We're going to come up with our own issue, affordability. You can't do that when it's an existential issue. You have to stand up and say, I'm going to be just as tough with Trump. And we know that Bonnie made the same mistake against Ford. They refused to talk about Trump because that was Ford's issue. No. When it's an issue that's that big, you have to be talking about it. That's the big mistake that Jenni made. And there was a lot of pressure internally in the party amongst candidates who lost, etc., that her time was up. So she was fired, but she was allowed to say that she quit. That's my opinion.
Which is usually how it goes anyway.
That's how it works. That's how it works.
That's how it works to save face. Look, I've made my views on the Conservative campaign pretty clear ad nauseum, so I think we're going to close off that topic there, and we're going to go to a topic that you wanted to speak about, which is the fact that over the last decade, more than 250 Canadian news outlets have closed, leaving many communities with little or no coverage. And again, as I said at the beginning of the episode, this is a broader trend, shrinking audiences, turning away from traditional media. And Ian, because you've worked as a journalist and you've witnessed these things up close, what do you think is driving the decline in local journalism here in Canada? And also, too, how does that compare to the consolidation or the changing media landscape in the U.S. as well?
The answer is follow the money. With the access that people had to the internet for what they thought was free news, it was supported by advertising revenue that the big giants, Facebook and X and the others, were stealing from Main Street media. I wrote a column for 9 years for a Toronto Star publication, and they were bleeding back then. The decade of 1990 is when I was writing, and they were bleeding money back then at the beginning of the internet revolution. It's gotten worse. And what the Star did is they started laying off some of their best reporters and best editors. So you had a double whammy. You had the advertisers fleeing, and then you had, as a result, you got to lay off the good people. Interestingly, a lot of those excellent journalists are podcasters today. So if you do a survey of Canadian podcasts, you see Wells, you'll see others that used to be political analysts for the major media. They're now having a career in podcasting, and
Especially
that's
when they get fired.
especially when they got fired or decide to retire. Okay,
Yeah.
and even Pakin has left TVO, where he was making over 300,000 a year, and is now a podcaster. And he used to be one of our best reporters, in my opinion. But even his podcasts today have are not as good as the TVO was 10 years ago. So you have the two trends. You have the money problem, and then you have the laying off good journalists, and then you have it kind of created a roller coaster. Then people stop buying the paper. And if you look at the three Toronto papers, all three of them have downsized the actual size of the paper. I remember when the Saturday Star was a half an inch thick. And you go and pick up a Toronto Star today, it's about the same size as the tabloid Toronto Sun. And the number of pages is down to maybe 16 or 32 pages, and that's all an economic problem.
It's economics, and it's the way that people are getting their news, and it's the news audience, right? Because the generation that was used to getting the paper at the front door are getting older, and
Yes,
some of them
they're
are
still
not
getting it. They're still getting the paper delivered, but
right. But
that
this
that
new
demographic,
generation,
yeah,
this new generation with TikTok, Instagram, all these different platforms, X. I was just checking X to get the news about what's
yeah,
happening at the Ukraine summit. So I think it's a lot to do with the changing landscape and how people are getting their news. It also has to do with the quality of journalists. A lot of these journalists that they're hiring, they're not your Peter Mansbridge. They're not,
no,
your Walter Cronkite, right? Those people are gone. They're not coming back.
Lloyd
But
Robertson was a good reporter in Canada.
Lloyd Robertson, I remember growing up when I was 6 or 7 years old. He was my Walter Cronkite. I
Yeah,
recognized that face, and now it's like I don't go to the nightly news to get my
no,
news. I go on to one of my favorite platforms is an American platform by a journalist whose name is Mark Halperin, very good journalist in the United States. Used to be on TV, he still is on TV, but he used to work for networks. He used to work for these newspapers, and now he's started his own thing. It's like a podcast where he goes on and he talks about the news of the day. And the thing is what he does is he does it on Zoom, and then even I was able to ask a question one day. I asked a question about the Iran stuff that was happening just a few months ago. I asked about tariffs. And the way that people are getting their news and their media is changing. If you are going to be a journalist, you've got to start thinking about new media because that's just the way things are going.
yeah.
You may
Well,
not get you may
I
not
did some. Oh, go ahead, finish.
you may not get people's attention for an hour a day, but you
Right.
can get their attention for 15 or 30 seconds when they're swiping on their phone. So go ahead and we'll kind of wrap it up there.
Well, I did some research on the people changing how they're getting their news, and of course, I did it on the internet. And in the United States, there's a recent report, and I think it's probably over exaggerated, that 90% of Americans get their news online now. And that same report looked at Canada and said 80% of Canadians get their news online. But it also said that of those, 67% are still watching some TV news and 40% are still getting some news from the radio. 36%, which would be my generation, are getting newspapers, still buying newspapers. So The trend is there. Younger people are moving away from newspapers. And newspapers have tried, and in fact, the last year I was with the Star publication, the Star tried to monetize their paper, and they put up paywalls, and nobody was paying. That made their problem even worse. And the other thing the Star was not doing is people were stealing their material, and they never thought, and then putting it on the internet, they never thought to have somebody sending out invoices. Well, my editor was reassigned to start sending out invoices, but it was several years after their stuff was already being stolen. So they were very slow to adapt, and I think they're dinosaurs.
Well, what a discussion we had today, Ian. It looks like the American president and the Russian president are going to be having a press conference in the next few minutes. So I think we'll save that discussion for next week. We'll see what happens, but it's been great as always to have you on. Thank you for coming on and for filling.
It's always a pleasure.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Remember to like, share, subscribe. The way that the algorithm works is if you like, subscribe, share, and all that, it gets to more people. But thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, however you chose. Have a great week. Bye.
Bye.